Good afternoon, friends and family, man. Hope you all doing well today. Two down and three to go, man. You know how time is flying. We already mid-May. We're almost basically mid-May, right? Yeah. Yeah. I'm just wanted to share something with you all today. Today was actually my first day back from staycation. I was on vacation last week. Didn't do much. Went to Ocean City, Maryland. Treated my wife to that. And Sunday, when I was driving on my way back home, my nephew sent me a text. My nephew, he's my son's age, 23 years old. And he's about to graduate college. Congratulations to him. He's about to graduate college, and he's thinking about moving out. He asked first when he texts me, Uncle Ken, I need some advice, some financial advice. He said that his credit is 550, and he asked me how can I bring it up. Cause usually he'll text me, he'll ask me questions and stuff like that, and then I'll text him back. But I was like, I won't be able to answer that question. I'm gonna have to, speak to you. So you're gonna have to either call me or I'll call you. What's a good time for me to call you tomorrow, which was yesterday? And he told me 3:30 actually. I was like, all right, no problem. I'll give you a call, so that way I want to know why you have a 550 credit score. So yesterday I called him up at 3:30. Actually, I called him up at 3:35. I was busy. And then I was, basic conversation. Then I was like, the question that you asked me yesterday, you asked me, how can I bring my credit up from 550? I want to go to 650 in 3 months. I was like, what? I was like, why is your credit on 550? He was like, oh, I missed the payment. When I first started my credit journey, which was a couple of months ago, my credit score was 600, 650, something like that, he told me. And then he said that he missed the payment. I said, why did you miss the payment? He was like, oh, because I'm not working. I was like, you're not working? And then he was like, yeah, I just wanted to focus on, college this semester. I was like, yeah, but if you have debt, you have to pay the debt. You have to pay at least the minimum. You can't just be, like, okay, you know what, I don't have a job, I'm not going to be able to pay. You're going to have to find some type of way, for you to, make money to pay this debt that you have. I don't know what debt that you do have, but, that's a no-no. That's unacceptable because, to the banks, later on in the future, they're going to look at that. You know what I mean? So he was like, oh, I get money here and there. I pay the minimum. I was like, well, it's good to pay the minimum because I was in your shoes. When I was in college, I was borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. I had 3 credit cards. So every credit card that I had different dates for me to make those payments. And what I was doing, I was making the minimum payment for each and every card. Sometimes I'll take money from this card to pay this card, and I'll take money from this card to pay that card. And I was doing that. And but I had money, because I used to, get money from the Pell Grant. And every time I used to go home for Christmas, I used to work for those 3 weeks. And every time I used to go home for the summer, I used to work for those 2 months. So all the money that I made, working, and from the Pell Grant, I saved those, and I used to pay, the credit cards. That's how I was doing it until everything came crashing down the 3rd year. So I had to quit school and get a job to pay everything, to pay the credit cards and to pay the loans. That was my struggle when I went to college. Because I didn't want to put a strain, on my parents. I didn't want my parents taking loans for me, so I ended up taking out the loans myself. But for his situation, since I have experience and I went through what he's going through, and then he was like, okay, I could do that, but I told him it's going to take time for your credit to go back up. It's not going to be an overnight thing. You're talking about 3 months. Why 3 months? And then he was like, oh, because I want to move out. I was like, you want to move out? Now you want to move out? You don't have no income. He was like, yeah, I'm about to start working. And I was like, well, my advice to you is, because I left my parents' house when I was 25, 25, 26. My son's mother got pregnant. And when she got pregnant, I took it upon myself, to be responsible, the responsible person that I am, the responsible person that I was. Before she got pregnant, I was able to save up at least $10,000. And this was back in 2002, because my son was born 2000. 2003. So I was telling him the story. I was telling him, actually I told him this before. He was like, "Oh, uncle, I know you told me that to always have 3 to 6 months of living expenses." I was like, "Yeah, but when I moved out, I had $10,000. You know what I'm saying? And that was able to pay the security deposit first month, and I had to pay the finder's fee for my landlord. He jerked me, but I was desperate, and I wanted to live in a certain area in the Bronx, and I was able to accomplish that if it wasn't for him, because that same area that I wanted to live at, other agencies was telling me I didn't qualify. I didn't make enough money, but this landlord took a chance on me, and I ended up living in 3 of his apartments, for 10 years. All right, so that's another thing. Don't never ever let nobody tell you what you can or can't do. You know what I'm saying? If you're determined and you want something, you'll be able to achieve it, and that's what I ended up doing. But I had to explain that to my nephew. I told him, you can't just, why are you leaving your mom's house? Living in your mom's house is the opportunity for you to save your money, so that way when you move out, you have 3 to 6 months of living expenses. I told him that if your rent is $1,500, because he's trying to get into a 1-bedroom, and I think the 1-bedroom is going for like $1,500, $1,600 here in the Bronx. You want to have 3 times that amount. Actually, you want to have 4 to 5 times that amount. Just in case you fall into what we always talk about. Why it's important to save and invest. So I had to explain that to my nephew. Because he follows me on social media, so he sees the advice that I be giving to people. So that's why he personally, contacts me, to get financial advice. So I had to break that down to him, and I told him, listen, take advantage of you living in your parents' house. While you're there, pay a bill here and there. Help them out, pay a bill here and there, because you're already 23. I know you're a college student, but you got to help out with at least a bill here. You understand what I'm saying? Because that right there is gonna show you responsibility. You understand? So I had to break that down to him, and hopefully he listens, and hopefully I told him, do not move out and you don't have any money. You gotta have money. And then he was telling me about it. Should I get a roommate? Why would you get a roommate when you're living in your parents' house with your sisters? Is there a reason why you're leaving? Because it'll be the same thing. I'd rather just live by myself. Get my own apartment, live by myself. If I'm leaving my parents' house, why am I going to live in an apartment with a roommate? That's what I told him. So, it's something for him to think about. But for me, like my advice for anybody living in a parents' house, that's where you are going to build that responsibility. Pay a bill, pay 2 bills if you can, to help and alleviate, your parents, and to teach yourself responsibility. So that way when you move out, with 3 to 6 months of living expenses, you have a responsibility to pay more bills, because you're going to have more bills. You're going to have the electricity bill. You're going to have the cable bill. Well, now you don't have cable because, you have streaming services and stuff like that, but you got to pay the Con Ed bill. You got to pay the rent, and things like that, the expenses. You know what I mean? So that's something that, I had to, break it down, to my nephew. It's like talking to my son. If my son needs, any type of advice, he always, come to me and ask me a question here and there. So that's the reason why I wanted to shoot this video, and give advice to somebody of the age of my son, which is my nephew. All right, friends and family, thank you for tuning in. Hope you all have a wonderful day. And God willing, we're going to come back with week 20 this Friday of the 100 Envelope Savings Challenge, IRA Savings Challenge. All right? Peace and love.